Hi. Welcome to Dateline USA. I'm Vincent Yeo, and today we're going to talk about Notre Dame. Many of you may be familiar with the storied history of the football team from the University of Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish. Well, today we're going to talk about Notre Dame in somewhat of different light. We're going to travel back to 1924 on the University of Notre Dame campus in South Bend, Indiana. 1924 was a watershed year for the university. It was the beginning of Knute Rockne and the Four Horsemen and the storied football program of that great institution. However, today we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about a violent conflict that took place between Notre Dame and another uniquely American institution, the Ku Klux Klan. And in May of that year, they clashed in the streets of South Bend. It is chronicled by a book by Todd Tucker entitled The Notre Dame versus the Klan. It's a little-known part of the history of Notre Dame, and today we're going to talk to Todd on the telephone, and we're going to ask him about his book and ask him about these events, how they took place, and what motivated them. Hi, Todd.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. And I would like to say that I found your book to be a really most interesting read.
Good.
This is a little-known incident in the history of Notre Dame, isn't it?
It's very little known, even in Indiana, which is where I've lived my whole life. It's not well known, and the Klan takeover of the state in the 1920s is also not very well known. So.
Yes, there are so many surprising things in your book. First of all, how did you get interested in this, and what made you write this book?
Well, I was a history major at Notre Dame, and a writer trying to write books, and I had heard the story, the oral history version of the riot, but I didn't know a lot of details. And when I started looking into it, I just found that, all the characters involved on both sides, on the Klan and Notre Dame, were just, unbelievably fascinating personalities. So it just,
boy, they really were.
Started writing itself at that point.
Why do you think there's so little known about this?
Well, I think as far as, the big picture, the Klan taking over Indiana, one of the reasons is, obviously that it's not something the state of Indiana or Hoosiers are proud of or want to memorialize. I think another important reason it's not well known is that the whole thing happened so fast. The Klan came to Indiana in 1920. By 1923, the biggest Klan rally in history, about 200,000 people gathered in Kokomo, Indiana. In 1924, an avowed Klansman was elected governor, and the Klan had pretty much taken over every level of civic life in the state. And then in 1925, the Grand Dragon of the Klan, this kind of crazed genius named D.C. Stevenson, was convicted of just a horrible crime and locked up, and the Klan collapsed. So the whole Klan movement in Indiana rose and fell inside of about 5 years.
Yes, that's very interesting. I wonder, one of the things that really surprised me in your book, Todd, was the fact that the Klan in Indiana was more powerful, more prevalent, and probably more people than in states like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. Did you find that surprising? I found it fascinating.
Well, it was far more. The Klan in Indiana was far more powerful than it was in any other region or any other state. There were more members in the Indiana Klan than the southern states combined. At its peak in Indiana, which was somewhere around 1924, it was about 300,000 people in Indiana in the Klan, which represented about 1 out of 3 white men. So it was, the Klan peaked by any measure in Indiana in the 20s.
That's really amazing. I find that to be an amazing fact. Tell us, I want to talk about some of the characters in your book, some of the people who, the players in this rather unique incident. Tell us about the character and the personality of the president of Notre Dame at the time, Matthew Walsh.
Well, the characters on both sides of the fight really were both kind of emblematic of their movements, and Matthew Walsh, Father Matthew Walsh, certainly was. He was, an Irish Catholic kid from Chicago who went to the seminary when he was 15 years old and never left. If there was anything kind of unusual in Father Walsh's life from that point on, it was that as a young man he was actually vice president of Notre Dame already, and World War I broke out. And Notre Dame, wanting to be, conspicuously patriotic, sent a number of its priests, including Father Walsh, and he served with great distinction under fire in France, and was actually awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for what he did at the Second Battle of the Marne. And then he came back to Notre Dame, and within a few years became president.
Well, now tell us about his adversary, D.C. Stevenson, and the Klan. What was his relationship to the Klan, and why was he so charismatic? What is your...
Well, the question, why was he charismatic? That's I think that's always kind of a historical mystery in reference to charismatic people. I think that with Stevenson, it was a very practiced charisma. Stevenson, long before he'd ever heard of the Klan, was a very successful salesman. He had made himself fairly wealthy by selling a manner of different things. So he was a practiced salesman, an accomplished public speaker, and quite in that day he was really a master of kind of manipulating the media. So Stevenson did definitely have natural charisma, but he also had the practice skill of a good salesman. And in 1920 he was in Evansville working for a company that sold equipment to newspapers, and he was in Evansville, Indiana. He was not an Indiana native. But he was in Evansville, which is kind of the southernmost major city in the state, and the Klan, based in Atlanta, had sent someone to Evansville. They wanted to kind of expand their reach in the northern states, so they sent this guy named Joe Huffington to Evansville, and he was asking around, who's the best salesman in Evansville, and the name he kept hearing was D.C. Stevenson.
Why do you think... First of all, what kind of people populated the Klan? Were they all white Protestant men?
They were all white Protestant men, that's correct, but that's about as much as you can narrow it down. It's difficult to analyze with a lot of precision because a big part of the Klan's appeal was that its membership was secret. But there's been some very good academic research done on the subject with some membership rolls that have turned up. And in general, it seems that the members of the Klan, or the people the Klan appealed the most strongly to, were not the professional class, but not the lowest class either. It was somewhere in the middle, what we might call today the disaffected middle class.
Well, wasn't it also true that D.C. Stevenson had his political troubles within the Klan?
Absolutely. I mean, Stevenson almost from day one was battling with the national leadership of the Klan, which was based in Atlanta and which was personified by a guy named Hiram Evans, who was a dentist from Texas. And Hiram Evans was very closely associated with the kind of the Klan stereotype of vigilante violence and ill deeds done in the middle of the night. Stevenson, whose first priority throughout was to sell as many memberships as possible and make as much money as possible, recognized that this kind of vigilantism and this reputation for violence would do him no good with the people of Indiana. So those two men had very different philosophies about what the Klan should look like.
Wasn't his talent that of a salesman? Wasn't he considered the best recruiter for the Klan?
Stevenson was, absolutely. I mean, I think you know, there's no denying it by the numbers. Stevenson had a number of different techniques he used. He had a newspaper that was published across the Midwest, but his biggest and most successful technique for recruiting were these all-day rallies. He would have these massive all-day rallies that, you know, if you were dropped in the middle of one, it would look very much to you like a 4th of July picnic or a political rally. It was all about patriotic marching band music and flag waving. And, he would have these all-day rallies and recruit Hoosiers in droves. And it was one of these all-day rallies that he was planning on having in the second biggest city in the state, which happened to be South Bend, the home of Notre Dame.
Well, and weren't there a rather large number of law enforcement officers that were also members of the Klan and politicians?
Well, certainly, yeah, both groups, definitely. And what happened was, as the 20s went on, politicians kind of became less and less ashamed of their affiliation with the Klan, and the pinnacle, the Klan had really achieved, you know, had infiltrated every level of government in Indiana, from
Tell us about
city councils on up. But the pinnacle was this guy, Ed Jackson, who was Stevenson's friend and an avowed Klansman who in early May, right before the rally in South Bend, won the Republican nomination for governor, which then as now winning the Republican nomination in Indiana is pretty close to winning the election. So he was the Klan had taken over every level of government in Indiana.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, weren't you roommates with a grandson of one of the participants in the riot?
Not roommates. I lived in the same hall, which was Kavanaugh Hall. I had a photograph that I found in the Notre Dame archives of a Notre Dame sophomore in a set of Klan robes that he had absconded with during the first day of the riots.
That's a picture in your book.
The robes of the Klansmen kind of became the most popular trophy of the day for Notre Dame men. Mm-hmm. And I had a couple of witnesses to the riot, old men now, who were talking to me. And I sent this photo around and said, do you recognize who this is? And they told me it was a guy named William Fooey. And I said, well, I went to school with a Fooey, a guy named Mark Fooey, and I started looking into it, and sure enough, that was his grandfather. So I called up Mark one day, and after I hadn't talked to him since graduation in 1990, and said, Mark, I've got a picture of your grandfather that you're not going to believe.
Why don't you set up for us the events that really led to this riot in itself, that particular incident? What happened? What happened that made these two completely diverse institutions meet violently in the streets of South Bend?
Well, like I said, the Klan's most popular recruiting technique was having these huge all-day rallies and parades, and they had kind of been marching in a northern direction across the state, and South Bend was the second biggest city in the state at that time, and so South Bend was a natural choice for one of these rallies. And when they scheduled it, everyone knew weeks in advance that it was coming, but a few things had happened, that nowhere else in Indiana was there such a concentration of potentially hot-headed young Catholic men, and also the Ed Jackson, the Klansman, had won the Republican nomination for governor on May 6th, just a few days before the rally. So when the Klansmen started showing up in droves, as they did, hundreds of thousands of them, in South Bend, the students in Notre Dame, who were all men at that time, were not inclined to let it pass. So the Notre Dame students started going into town to see what was going on, and they decided kind of collectively that they were going to each get a set of these robes as a trophy, and it quickly devolved into just kind of general violence. And the Klansmen, for their part, were just completely taken off guard. Everywhere else in Indiana, they'd been welcomed with open arms. It was seen as a benevolent, patriotic organization. They couldn't believe that anybody would oppose their coming to town like this. So they really.
So really, what you're saying is the students at Notre Dame are the ones that instigated the riot.
Well, I guess it depends on how you define instigated. You have a group that had kind of sworn to defend America against Catholics. We're going to have a parade, and had a fiery cross downtown. There were certainly people at the time that thought that was pretty provocative.
Well, didn't President Walsh do all he could do to deter this, to stop it.
Absolutely. I mean, Father Walsh was a very, very conservative, very reserved administrator, and his philosophy towards the Klan and towards all anti-Catholic groups was always to ignore it, and that had been not just his policy, but kind of the attitude of Catholic leadership in the country was, well, if when these yahoos occasionally raise their heads, just ignore them long enough and they'll go away, and that was certainly Walsh's philosophy. But with the state on the verge of being governed by a Klansman governor, it was becoming a position that was harder and harder to defend.
How did these riots affect the university? What was the posture of the university after the riots?
Well, I think there were consequences that you can still see today. For one thing, that Notre Dame had been growing rapidly before that, and one of the kind of in the post-mortem of this thing, one thing the administration decided that had been a factor was that so many Notre Dame students lived in South Bend because there wasn't anywhere to accommodate them all on campus. So in the immediate aftermath of the riot, Father Walsh devoted himself to building dormitories on campus in his remaining years as president to bring all the students back to campus. And still today, Notre Dame has a very unusually high proportion of its students that live on campus.
Yes, it's uniquely residential, isn't it?
What's that? I'm sorry.
It is uniquely residential.
It is, and there's no Greek system in Notre Dame either.
No, I know.
They're all living in these residence halls on campus, and I think it also set the tone where Notre Dame, for a long, long time, really did not completely trust the civic authorities of the area. And I think maybe some of that is starting to thaw now, but it certainly, when I was there, I think there was certainly a lot of that distrust was still palpable.
Yeah, understandable. Tell us about it. Now, D.C. Stevenson, one of the main players in this event from the Klan, met a very bad end, didn't he?
He did. In the days after the riot, the Klan was still very much on the upswing. In fact, there were conspiracy theorists that thought that Stevenson had set up this whole riot so that in the days before the general election, Hoosiers would kind of see the lawless nature of these immigrant Catholics. And in the riot was in May. In November, Ed Jackson, the Klansman, won in a landslide the general election. So the Klan had not yet peaked when the riot took place. But at the inaugural ball for his friend Ed Jackson, Stevenson met a young woman, a state employee named Madge Oberholzer. And within a few months of that inaugural ball, Stevenson kidnapped her, repeatedly raped her on a train to Hammond, Indiana, and eventually returned her home after 3 days. But Madge would eventually die in agonizing pain, and Stevenson was eventually convicted of murdering her by his bite wounds that he inflicted on her. So the murder trial and Stevenson's conviction was one of the most spectacular things that had ever happened in the Indiana legal system up to that point, and Hoosiers were horrified and fascinated by what the Grand Dragon had done.
How do you feel? Do you feel that most of this was motivated perhaps by a famous film of those days by Griffith, The Birth of a Nation?
Well, certainly the Klan in the United States has had kind of three historically distinct incarnations. It came to life in the Reconstruction South immediately after the Civil War, and then was put down for a time.
I suppose that many of the people viewing this don't know anything about Birth of a Nation or that such a movie could be made.
Right.
I think we have a clip of that. Could we show that?
Absolutely.
You know, it's very interesting that that this movie could have been made so overtly racist. It was made, I believe, in 1915.
That's right. It premiered in 1915.
And I think it had a profound influence on anti-Catholic thought in this country, don't you?
Well, it definitely, I mean, it directly led to the rebirth of the Klan, which had been dormant since Reconstruction. There was a kind of a hustler in Atlanta named Colonel William Simmons who decided he was going to refound the Klan and take on the popularity of this movie as a recruiting vehicle. But I think that when you watch a modern viewer watching Birth of a Nation, cannot miss just the overt racism. But I think that racism you see in there was very much, a mainstream attitude in 1915. And most people, the millions of people who saw that film, millions of whom it was the first movie they'd ever seen, they just took it for granted that it was a completely historically accurate depiction of Reconstruction, and it depicts Klansmen as heroes. It depicts Klansmen as the people who rescued the South from anarchy and from the vindictiveness of the North. Let's
go back to the riots for a second. What's really interesting in your book is President Walsh or none of the administration or faculty had such a profound influence on the students who seemed to be out of control, at least they thought so. But the person who really motivated them and more or less convinced them to calm down was none other than Newt Rockne.
Well, Father Walsh was definitely in charge, and none of this is to short Walsh his due for what he accomplished. Walsh was the one who, on the second day of the riots, went to the courthouse lawn and climbed atop a Civil War cannon and kind of single-handedly ended the riot. But after 3 days of riots, Walsh knew that things could just continue to get worse and more violent. So Walsh recognized that there was a man on campus who kind of had the most proven ability to motivate the young men of Notre Dame, and that was Newt Rockne. So he called a meeting in Washington Hall of all the Notre Dame students and had Rockne address them, where Rockne told them kind of in locker room halftime pep talk fashion that they were all members of the Notre Dame team and Walsh was their quarterback and they had to listen to Father Walsh's signals.
Yeah, that's very interesting. He put it in terms of the football team, that Father Walsh was the quarterback and they were the players.
Well, it's no different today. It's the quickest way to get a room full of Notre Dame students' attention is to start talking about football. So
absolutely. And tell me, how did the mood of the students after the riots affect the spirit of the football team and the legend that came after?
Well, it is worth noting that this riot took place in May 1924, and a Klansman was elected governor in November 1924. And the following football season, after perhaps the most anti-Catholic year in American history, the national champion in college football was Notre Dame, led by Newt Rockne and the Four Horsemen.
Yeah, didn't they beat Stanford in the Rose Bowl? And
they won the 1925 Rose Bowl against Stanford.
Yeah.
And became national champions. And Notre Dame football had been, on the verge of becoming a national institution before then. The George Gipp phenomenon happened in 1920. That was the year George Gipp was selected to be Notre Dame's first All-American and died and gave this famous deathbed speech to Rockne about win one for the Gipper. But the first national championship happened in 1925, the year after the football season immediately following the riot.
It's very interesting. Notre Dame was known for years as simply a football school. Now it's probably one of the finest universities in the country, perhaps ranked undergrad school in the top 20.
It is in a lot of different measures. It certainly is in terms of competitiveness.
Yeah. So it's come a long way since that French priest in the 1840s built a log cabin in the middle of the Indiana winter, isn't it?
Right. Well, I think there's certainly been Notre Dame people in the Notre Dame administration in recent years who've been very sensitive about the topic of football and are
yes, they have.
Maybe a little touchy about Notre Dame being identified as a football school, because for so long that was the stereotype, and Notre Dame now is academically and by any measure one of the greatest schools of the country.
Yeah. I think perhaps an interesting end to all of this is that the governor of Indiana in 1924 was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and the governor today is a graduate of Notre Dame.
That's correct, Joe Kernan. He's a South Bend native, graduated from St. Joe High School, which is run by the Holy Cross, and a Notre Dame graduate and a Vietnam War hero to boot.
It's a fitting end to the story, isn't it?
It is, and he's got a real fight on his hands here in a few weeks.
Yeah, I guess he does. Yeah, this is the book, Notre Dame versus the Klan. It's a very interesting read. I want to thank you very much, Todd.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It was a wonderful conversation, and it's a good read.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I guess we all don't know as much about history as we think we know. We think we know the story of a certain institution, but there are certain facts that we don't know. And this is the most interesting fact about the University of Notre Dame, the lore and the legend of his football team, but very few people knew that at the beginning of that legend, there was a very violent event. Thank you very much. I'm Vincent Yeo, and this is Dateline USA.